Nobody remembered hiring Lena. They just knew she'd always been there. Every morning, she arrived at the grand mansion atop Sycamore Hill before the sun rose. She moved like a whisper, wiping dust off imported vases, picking up the glass shards from last night's party, tucking away the forgotten scandals of the Whitmore family with quiet efficiency. She was just the maid. But that winter, something changed. Lena had never been the kind of person who took up space. That's what made her so good at what she did. She was the quiet thread in the grand tapestry of the Whitmore estate, seen only in glimpses, like a shadow disappearing around corners, her presence as forgettable as the dust she swept away each dawn. She arrived before sunrise, always. Her hands, worn but graceful, moved with the elegance of repetition. No wasted motion. No unnecessary noise. She knew the feel of each floorboard, the subtle flicker of the lights that needed replacing, the way the scent of peonies faded before noon in the East Wing. She understood the rhythms of the house better than the family who lived in it. To the Whitmores, Lena was part of the architecture, useful, invisible, safe. That illusion shattered the morning the blue vow vanished. The necklace had always been more than a family heirloom. It was a statement. 6 generations of power, condensed into a cascade of deep blue sapphires and quiet menace. It sat on velvet beneath glass, under lock and key in the master bedroom, a jewel no one wore, but everyone feared losing. Its presence assured the world that the Whitmores were untouchable. When it disappeared, the reaction was immediate and chilling. An emergency descended over the mansion, not with chaos, but with a strange, surgical precision. The household contracted. Conversations became whispers. Staff meetings turned into interrogations in all but name. The family's social calendar evaporated overnight. By mid-morning, every employee had been gathered, questioned, and subtly scrutinized. But scrutiny didn't fall evenly. It slid, with increasing certainty, toward the one who had the least power to deflect it. Lena. She had been the last person in the master bedroom. That detail, alone, became prophecy. No one accused her directly. That would have been too crude. Instead, their silence grew pointed. Their eyes lingered. Her routine, once uninterrupted, was now shadowed. Doors that used to open with a key were locked without warning. Requests became commands. She felt her presence tighten like a noose. Surveillance footage was reviewed, but the system had suffered a mysterious failure that night, something to do with the storm, or so they claimed. The backup logs were corrupted. The guards shrugged. The cameras had gone dark just long enough for trust to evaporate. And with no proof to save her, Lena became the unspoken answer to the unasked question. She said nothing. She changed nothing. She moved through her tasks with the same care as always. But inside, something ancient stirred. Not panic. Not fear. A kind of quiet reckoning. She had lived through worse. Much worse. What the Whitmores didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask, was that Lena hadn't always been a maid. In another life, one that had been scrubbed clean and filed away under a different name, she had been a journalist. Not a famous one, but a determined one. She had spent years digging through corruption, untangling political lies, and shining a light into places powerful men wanted to keep dark. It had almost killed her. It had cost her everything. A ruined career. A burned identity. A scar across her ribs from a night she still remembered only in fragments. She had run. She had hidden. She had survived. And when she resurfaced, it was as a housemaid in a mansion full of people who thought silence equaled stupidity. She had been watching the Whitmores for a long time. Not just the family, but the house itself. Its patterns. Its weaknesses. She had cataloged inconsistencies in deliveries, the way staff were paid under separate shell companies, and how Edgar Whitmore's foundation always seemed to send money to countries with lax tax laws. She had never intended to do anything with that information. Not at first. She only gathered it out of habit. The way old soldiers still flinch at loud noises. But now, they had made her a suspect. Her room was searched. Her locker rifled through. Her personal items examined by people who didn't know what they were looking at. The books she read, philosophy, psychology, historical biographies, suddenly seemed out of place in their hands. One supervisor asked where she got them. She didn't answer. A week passed. The necklace was still missing. The pressure didn't break her, it pressed her into something sharper. She began to take stock of everything more intentionally. She made mental notes of shifting alliances within the household staff. Noticed who avoided her gaze and who suddenly tried to befriend her. She watched Isla Whitmore, young, elegant, and impatient, as she moved through the halls like someone who had already decided how the story would end. And then there was the matter of the cameras. Lena knew how to read systems. She had once decrypted military-grade files from a corrupted flash drive during a scandal in South Africa. Now, she quietly borrowed a maintenance laptop left unattended and found that the security failure that night hadn't been an accident. The timestamp manipulation was crude, not professional. It wasn't sabotage, it was theater. Someone inside the house had orchestrated it. And Lena wasn't about to let them succeed. They thought she was just the maid. They thought she would shrink beneath suspicion. They thought her silence was submission. But Lena had spent years perfecting invisibility. Now, she would use it. Not to survive. To dismantle. The mansion breathed differently at night. Gone were the stiff greetings, the hollow laughter echoing through tall ceilings, the clatter of polished silverware on porcelain. After midnight, the Whitmoore estate slipped off its public mask. What remained was older, quieter, and more honest. It was in those hours that Lena moved most freely. She no longer cleaned. She observed. The house had always whispered, but now she listened with intention. The creak in the third stair. The slow drip behind the guest wings wall. The faint scent of sandalwood trailing from Edgar Whitmore's private office after hours. Everything was a clue, a pulse, a breadcrumb. She traced them with the precision of someone who'd once been trained to spot what others missed. She didn't need to force anything. People always revealed themselves in how they moved when they believed no one was watching. Upstairs, the family remained cloistered, avoiding scandal by pretending the incident had resolved itself. The story had shifted subtly in their social circles. The necklace wasn't lost, just temporarily removed for restoration. That lie bought them time. It also deepened the illusion that Lena was disposable. She let them believe it. By day, she endured the new protocols. Her tasks became menial and always supervised. Rooms she once tended to alone were now paired with someone else, always someone new, always someone instructed to watch without seeming to. But their vigilance was superficial. They were trained to control, not to notice. Lena noticed everything. In the laundry chute, she found a silk scarf stained faintly with engine grease, a strange artifact for a woman like Isla Whitmore, whose hands had never touched a steering wheel, let alone a machine. In the cellar, she discovered a dusty crate of outdated surveillance equipment, the kind phased out years ago but never properly disposed of. There were duplicate keycards hidden among old wine bottles. She took one, just in case. She began mapping the house in a way no blueprint ever had. Not just the physical layout, but the social geography, who moved where, when, and why. She timed the comings and goings of the delivery vans. She learned the guard rotation by watching reflections in the glass doors. The estate, in all its splendor, had never felt more fragile. The staff, too, cracked under the strain. Murmurs spread in the break room. Someone had seen a light flicker in the safe room at 3 in the morning. Someone else whispered that the gardener's brother had once served time for burglary, and maybe he was involved. Fingers pointed in every direction, conveniently away from the family. Loyalty decayed. Distrust bloomed. Through it all, Lena remained still, collecting fragments. Her notebooks, hidden behind loose bricks in the maintenance corridor, were filling fast. Lists of inconsistencies. Sketches of modified locks. Dates and times. Names. She wasn't sure yet what she was building, but the outline of a truth was forming. Not just about the missing necklace, but about the house itself. She started to suspect that the blue vow had never left the estate at all. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed in. The fear of being wrong. The risk of retaliation. The suffocating knowledge that she was utterly alone. But then she would remember the scar under her ribcage. The story no one in this house knew. The night she had trusted the wrong person, spoken the truth too loudly, and paid for it with blood. That memory had nearly broken her. Now, it anchored her. There was something else, too, something unexpected. A housekeeper named Rose had started leaving tea in the break room again, despite the tension. A small act, unspoken. One evening, Lena noticed an old staff ledger tucked under the table, left out, perhaps by mistake, or perhaps on purpose. It showed that the head of security, who had publicly reprimanded Lena after the theft, had been on probation for misconduct at another estate. That page disappeared from the book the next day, but not before Lena photographed it. The house didn't feel like a home anymore, not even to its owners. It felt like a decaying stage set, where everyone had forgotten their lines, and only Lena could still see the cracks behind the paint. What she was building wasn't just a defense. It was a mirror. She wasn't trying to clear her name. She was trying to hold up a reflection so clear that the Whitmoores would be forced to see what they had become. The necklace was a symbol, yes, but so was she. A silent woman. A working hand. An easy scapegoat. They had built their lives on the backs of the invisible, never realizing that invisibility was a weapon in its own right. And Lena was done surviving. She was preparing to reveal. The unraveling didn't begin with a confrontation. It began with a silence that lasted too long. On a Thursday morning, Edgar Whitmoore arrived late for his board call. Not unusual. But that morning, the call was already in progress when he entered, and someone had forwarded an anonymous packet, photos, documents, timestamped logs, detailing inconsistencies in the house's security reports. It wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to the head of the audit committee. No one knew who had sent it. But the whispers began. The staff knew before the family did. The way power trembles is felt first by those who live beneath its weight. The head of security, once smug, suddenly avoided eye contact. His morning rounds grew shorter. The other staff followed suit, instinctively sensing a shift in wind. There were more breaks, more unfinished tasks, more locked doors left slightly ajar. Lena kept her rhythm unchanged. Her silence wasn't out of fear anymore. It was purposeful. In the West Wing, where the family's private quarters lay nestled behind velvet-lined walls and biometric locks, tensions had begun to ferment. Isla Whitmore spent longer hours in her study, making urgent, whispered calls. Her perfectly maintained calm had begun to fray, as though the lie about the necklace, once so neat, had started unraveling in her mind as well. Then came the audit. 3 men in gray suits arrived, unannounced, claiming it was a routine review. But the staff had seen such men before. They were not routine. Their shoes were quiet, and their eyes moved constantly. They asked questions no one answered. They stayed late. It was during their 3rd day in the house that Lena left a sealed envelope beneath one of their laptops and signed, but unmistakably informed. It contained a map of the basement, with a small X marked behind the wall of the old wine vault. The next day, a maintenance crew was called in. Brick dust powdered the cellar floor. The vault wall had been tampered with, sloppily resealed. Behind it, nestled in a velvet-lined box and wrapped in aged linen, sat the blue vow. Still in the house. Still whole. But not where it belonged. The family was shocked, publicly. Internally, a rift widened. The story couldn't hold anymore. The narrative of the necklace being restored collapsed. And with it came a flood of uncomfortable questions. Who moved it? Why had the family claimed it was gone? Why had no one filed a police report? Answers were slow, carefully worded, legal in tone. But the court of perception moved faster than truth. The security chief was dismissed within hours. His contract terminated for cause. A statement was issued to the media about internal miscommunication and restructuring. But behind the polished wording was a house cracking under its own secrets. Lena's name was never mentioned. Yet, everything pointed back to her absence, from the accusation, from the chaos, from the theater of blame. She had simply continued her work, moving through the estate like a ghost with purpose. Her quiet, unwavering presence became unsettling. In a place built on control, nothing was more terrifying than what couldn't be managed. Isla began watching her. Not openly, but from windows, from mirrors, from behind the sharp glint of suspicion in her eyes. There was no gratitude, no apology, just an unease too old and too proud to be named. Lena didn't want their thanks. What she wanted was already happening. The staff began to shift. Rose started speaking to her again. Small gestures first, a cup left for her, a towel folded neatly where Lena hadn't left one. Others followed. A nod, a smile, a shared glance in the hallway that said, "We know." One by one, the invisible found each other. Lena's notebooks disappeared, burned in the incinerator the same night the necklace was discovered. They had served their purpose. She had no need for a paper trail. Instead, she carried memory and something more powerful, proof of what silence could achieve when it was chosen, not forced. By the end of the week, the estate had changed. Not visibly. The chandeliers still gleamed. The corridors still echoed. The parties resumed, though more subdued. The Whitmoores, careful now, had learned a valuable lesson. Not everything beneath them was beneath notice. The necklace returned to its glass case, restored and revered. Guests were told a story of recovery, of triumph over a minor internal oversight. And no one, at least no one important, asked further questions. But behind closed doors, contracts were rewritten. Surveillance protocols changed. Staff turnover slowed. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Lena received a quiet offer to remain with the estate, with increased pay and oversight privileges. She declined. On her last day, no one walked her to the gate. She didn't expect them to. The ones who mattered had already said goodbye in their own way. A pressed flower tucked into her coat pocket. A note folded inside her lunch. A single word written on the back of a cleaning rota: strength. As she passed the front gates, sunlight struck the marble just right, throwing soft halos across the walkway. The estate looked the same, but she knew better. She had altered something essential, not the power structure. That remained, but its illusion, the unshakable belief that the help would always remain voiceless. And maybe, just maybe, that shift would ripple outward. Lena never told anyone the full truth. Not to the other staff, not to the auditors, not even to the few she trusted quietly over the years. It wasn't fear that kept her silent. It was something deeper, an instinct born from knowing that some truths only gather strength when they remain unspoken. Letting others fill in the blanks had always been safer, but now it was strategic. Her silence wasn't absence anymore. It was authorship. The Whitmoore estate still stood, towering, immaculate, and cold. To the outside world, nothing had changed. The parties resumed, the guest list remained golden, and Isla's curated image of refined grace never cracked in the public eye. But Lena knew, beneath the varnish, something subtle had shifted. The illusion had been pierced. Back in the city, Lena's world was smaller, quieter, but it was her own. Her apartment was tucked above a bakery, just far enough from the city center that the rent stayed reasonable. Each morning, the smell of warm bread crept through the vents, mingling with the hum of early traffic and distant dog barks. She kept her routine, but this time by choice. Tea in the morning, a walk past the river, and sometimes a book she never finished reading, just holding it as the pages flared open in her lap. At first, she did nothing with her newfound clarity. She rested. Let the weight of years spent in service slide off like an ill-fitting coat. But rest only holds meaning if followed by purpose. So she began volunteering at a local community kitchen, not out of obligation, but curiosity. She liked the people there. Their voices were rougher, less polished. They didn't care who had what title or which cutlery to use at dinner. They cared about time, about warmth, about whether someone remembered their name the next day. Lena never needed to announce herself. She observed, the way she always had, learning rhythms before stepping in. Her silence was noticed, but not mistrusted. Here, it wasn't interpreted as weakness, it was space. And space, in these rooms, was rare. She peeled carrots, organized shelves, wiped down counters. Sometimes, she offered a gentle reminder for someone to take their medication. Other times, she just sat with a woman who spoke only in song fragments and memory. These small acts added up, stacking into something weightier than she expected. One day, she saw her reflection in a bakery window while waiting for a bus. She didn't look different. Same posture, same calm face. But the feeling underneath had changed. It wasn't pride, exactly. More like stillness. The kind that comes from seeing the machinery of power up close and choosing to no longer be a part of it. She kept tabs on the estate, out of habit more than interest. News clippings, mostly. Photos from events. Articles written in careful praise. Isla still appeared regal, though the smile didn't reach her eyes as much. Edgar had taken a temporary step back from several board positions, citing stress. A restructuring followed. Quiet, tidy, and corporate. But it wasn't just them who had changed. Months later, Lena received a letter, not from the Whitmoores, but from a former junior staff member named Lena. The handwriting was nervous, the message brief. Thank you. I don't know what happened exactly, but after everything, I started asking different questions. I left. I'm studying now. You gave us more than you know. Lena folded the note gently, placed it inside a book she'd never planned to finish, and smiled. Her power hadn't come from revenge or exposure. It had come from presence. From staying when it was easier to disappear. From watching when others turned away. And when the moment arrived, she had acted, not loudly, but with precision. And that action had rippled. It wasn't dramatic. There were no confessions. No courtroom showdowns. Just a quiet reordering of what people thought was possible. She hadn't toppled the house, but she had cracked its foundation. And sometimes, that was enough. Occasionally, she would still wake before dawn and reach for her old habits. Checking locks. Listening for footsteps in the hallway. But those instincts softened with time. Now, when she rose early, it was to water the plants on her windowsill, to watch the city stretch itself awake. The future no longer frightened her. She didn't need luxury. She didn't crave vengeance. What she wanted now was resonance, moments that mattered, however small. A child smiling after a warm meal. A new volunteer asking her for advice. A late-night walk where she didn't feel invisible, but grounded. Lena never returned to estate work. She was offered positions, subtly, discreetly, by people who had heard whispers of her competence. But she declined them all. She had spent too long being the ghost in other people's stories. Now, she wanted to write her own. And she began to do just that. In a simple notebook, she started sketching scenes, memories reshaped into fiction. A house not unlike the Whitmoores, a maid not unlike herself, a truth buried in velvet and glass. She didn't know if she'd finish it. That wasn't the point. The point was to take back the narrative, to tell it on her own terms. Sometimes she wondered what Isla thought of her now, whether the matriarch ever suspected the depth of Lena's involvement, whether it haunted her, whether it humbled her. But then, Lena would shake the thought loose. She had no need for their thoughts anymore. What mattered now were the people who had seen her, the ones who had started asking questions, the ones who had chosen change. She was one person, but her choice had echoed. And in a world full of polished lies and whispered orders, sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is speak with their actions, and let the silence carry truth farther than any voice ever could. Years later, a new family moved into the Whitmoore estate. They brought their own decorators, imported their own art. The walls were repainted, the chandeliers rewired. Servants were replaced. Gardens were re-landscaped. The house looked the same from a distance, but it wasn't. One of the new housekeepers found something strange tucked behind a false panel in the library wall. A tiny notebook, water-stained and barely legible, written in the margin of an old maintenance log. Just a few sentences, unremarkable to most. But the words hinted at something: an accounting discrepancy, a name written twice, a date crossed out and replaced without explanation. The housekeeper showed it to no one. Instead, she folded the page and kept it in her apron pocket. Over time, she began paying closer attention, noticed the way money moved, watched the way people spoke when they thought no one was listening. She saw patterns. She saw shadows. And one night, after her shift ended, she walked to the edge of the estate grounds, turned her back on the marble pillars, and didn't come back. She didn't know Lena's name, but she had walked the same halls. She had seen how power tried to disguise itself in elegance. And in that tiny, fragile note, buried in dust and near-forgotten ink, she had felt something stir. A thread left behind not by accident, but design. A whisper that said, "Look deeper. You are not alone." Back in the city, Lena never learned about the notebook. She didn't need to. Some stories are not meant to be finished, only passed on. And so the legacy continued, not in books or headlines or portraits, but in every quiet step, every person who refused to be erased. A lineage of watchful eyes and silent knowing. Women who saw everything and chose their moment carefully. Because in the end, the walls never kept the secrets. It was always the dust that remembered.